The story of Eddie Lee Sexton is one of the most terrifying chronicles in modern crime history. Eddie Lee Sexton, a seemingly ordinary man, wielded a sinister power over his family, turning their lives into a living nightmare. His reign of terror lasted for years, leaving an indelible mark on all who came into contact with him. Eddie's story is not just about the crimes he committed, but also about the psychological terror he inflicted on those closest to him. The Sexton family lived under a constant cloud of fear and control, with Eddie at the helm dictating every aspect of their lives. From his manipulative tactics to the ultimate unraveling of his dark secrets, each section will shed light on the horrifying experiences of his victims. The victims' stories are central to understanding the full scope of Eddie Lee Sexton's crimes.
Eddie Lee Sexton was an American convicted murderer and rapist known for compelling his children to murder and for committing sexual abuse against his own family, which he ruled in a cult-like manner. He fathered at least 3 children with 2 of his daughters. Rick Tarana, Eddie Sexton's defense attorney, described the Sextons as the most dysfunctional family in America. The case earned national attention, due in part to some of the graphic and sensational details revealed in court. Eddie Lee Sexton was captured after living as a fugitive for over a year to avoid child abuse charges. He was sentenced to death for orchestrating the murder of his son-in-law, Joel, by holding a gun to the head of his own son, Willie, and telling him to strangle Joel. Sexton was also given an additional 15 years for conspiracy to commit kidnapping and murder of an acquaintance. After appeal, Sexton's death penalty case was overturned and a new trial ordered. After retrial, he was again found guilty and sentenced to death, but died in prison of natural causes.
Eddie Lee Sexton was born in 1942 in rural West Virginia, into a family that struggled with poverty and instability. Growing up, Eddie learned to be resourceful and manipulative, traits that would later define his relationship with his own family. Despite his unassuming appearance, Eddie possessed a dark and controlling nature that would eventually surface in the most horrifying ways. Upon returning to civilian life, Eddie married and started a family. On the surface, they appeared to be a normal, hard-working family. However, behind closed doors, Eddie's true nature began to reveal itself. Eddie's children grew up in an environment of fear and obedience. The Sexton family's life under Eddie's rule was a constant cycle of abuse, manipulation, and terror. The true extent of Eddie Lee Sexton's control over his family began to unravel in the early 1990s. By this time, Eddie had instilled a deep sense of fear and obedience in his children. However, cracks in his carefully constructed facade started to appear, leading to the eventual exposure of his crimes. One of the pivotal moments in the case was the death of Eddie's son-in-law, Joel Good. Joel was married to Eddie's daughter, Pixie, and had become a target of Eddie's wrath. Eddie saw Joel as a threat to his control over Pixie and their children. In a chilling turn of events, Eddie ordered his son, Willie, to murder Joel. Joel's murder marked the beginning of the end for Eddie Lee Sexton. The family was forced to flee their home, moving to a remote area in Florida in an attempt to evade law enforcement. The walls were closing in on Eddie, and his dark secrets were about to be exposed. The Sexton family's life in Florida was nothing short of a nightmare. Eddie's control over his family had reached new heights, and the remote location only served to intensify their isolation. The house they lived in became a prison, where Eddie's reign of terror continued unabated. The children were subjected to constant fear and manipulation with no hope of escape. Eddie's wife, Estella, was also a victim of his control. She was coerced into participating in his schemes and was unable to protect her children from his abuse. The turning point came when Eddie's daughter, Pixie, reached out for help. Desperate to escape her father's control and protect her children, Pixie confided in a neighbor about the horrors they were enduring. The neighbor, alarmed by Pixie's revelations, contacted law enforcement. This act of courage set in motion a series of events that would ultimately lead to Eddie's arrest and the end of his reign of terror. Eddie Lee Sexton's ability to manipulate and control his family was a key factor in his reign of terror. He used psychological tactics to instill fear and obedience in his children, ensuring that they were completely dependent on him. Eddie's manipulation extended to every aspect of their lives, from their daily routines to their relationships with each other. One of the ways Eddie maintained control was by isolating his family from the outside world. The frequent moves and remote living conditions prevented the children from forming outside relationships or seeking help. Eddie also used physical and psychological abuse to reinforce his control. Joel Good's murder was a prime example of Eddie's willingness to eliminate anyone who challenged his authority. The impact of Eddie's manipulation on his children was profound. Eddie's manipulation left deep scars on his family, and the effects of his control were felt long after his arrest. The true tragedy of Eddie Lee Sexton's crimes lies in the suffering of his victims. His children, who endured years of abuse and manipulation, were the primary victims of his reign of terror. Each child's experience was unique, but the common thread was the pervasive fear and control exerted by Eddie. Pixie Sexton, Eddie's daughter, was one of the most affected by his control. She was forced to participate in his schemes and was a key witness to the horrific events that unfolded. Pixie's bravery in reaching out for help was a turning point in the case, but the impact of her father's control left deep scars. Willie Sexton, Eddie's son, was another victim of his manipulation. Willie was coerced into committing murder, believing he had no choice but to obey his father. Estella Sexton, Eddie's wife, was also a victim of his abuse. The turning point in the Eddie Lee Sexton case came when Pixie Sexton made the courageous decision to seek help. Living under her father's oppressive control had become unbearable, and she feared for the safety of her children. Pixie's decision to confide in a neighbor was a pivotal moment that set in motion a chain of events leading to Eddie's arrest. Pixie's cry for help was a desperate attempt to escape the cycle of abuse and control. The neighbor she confided in was alarmed by her revelations and immediately contacted law enforcement. When law enforcement officials arrived at the Sexton home, they were met with a scene of chaos and despair. Pixie's account of the abuse and manipulation they had endured was crucial in building the case against Eddie. The turning point in the case was marked by the courage of a daughter who dared to break free from her father's control and seek justice for her family. The investigation into Eddie Lee Sexton's crimes was a complex and painstaking process. Law enforcement officials were faced with the daunting task of unraveling years of abuse, manipulation, and criminal activity. The testimonies of Eddie's children and wife were crucial in building a case against him. The investigation revealed a pattern of systematic abuse and control. Eddie had used fear and intimidation to maintain his grip on his family, preventing them from seeking help or escaping his control. The murder of Joel Good was a key focus of the investigation, as it highlighted Eddie's willingness to use violence to maintain control. Eddie's arrest marked a significant turning point in the case. The arrest of Eddie Lee Sexton was a moment of relief for his family, but it was also the beginning of a long and difficult journey towards justice. The trial of Eddie Lee Sexton was a high-profile case that garnered significant media attention. It was a moment of reckoning for Eddie and a chance for his victims to seek justice. The courtroom became a battleground where the full extent of Eddie's crimes was laid bare for the world to see. The testimonies of his children and wife were central to the prosecution's case, providing a harrowing account of the abuse and manipulation they had endured. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence against Eddie, including witness testimonies, physical evidence, and expert analysis. Eddie's defense attempted to downplay the extent of his control and manipulation, portraying him as a misunderstood and flawed individual. However, the overwhelming evidence against him made it clear that Eddie was a dangerous and manipulative predator. In the end, Eddie Lee Sexton was found guilty on multiple charges, including murder, abuse, and conspiracy. Understanding the psychological profile of Eddie Lee Sexton is key to comprehending the extent of his crimes. Eddie exhibited traits consistent with several psychological disorders, including narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. His ability to manipulate and control those around him was a hallmark of his behavior, and his lack of empathy and remorse made him a dangerous individual. Eddie's childhood and early life experiences likely played a role in shaping his psychological profile. Growing up in an unstable and abusive environment, Eddie learned to use manipulation and control as survival mechanisms. By the time he started his own family, Eddie's manipulative tendencies had become deeply ingrained. Eddie's lack of empathy and remorse was evident throughout his interactions with his family and during his trial. Understanding his psychological profile provides valuable insight into the mind of a man who inflicted so much pain and suffering on his family. The dark legacy of Eddie Lee Sexton serves as a haunting reminder of the impact of psychological manipulation and control. His reign of terror over his family left deep scars that would take years to heal. The courage of his victims, particularly his children, in seeking justice highlights the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. The case of Eddie Lee Sexton also underscores the importance of early intervention and support for victims of abuse. The signs of Eddie's manipulative and controlling behavior were present long before his crimes came to light. This case serves as a call to action for society to be vigilant and supportive of those who are victims of abuse and manipulation. Mental health professionals play a crucial role in providing support and treatment for both victims and perpetrators, helping to break the cycle of abuse. By understanding the psychological aspects of his behavior and supporting victims of abuse, we can work towards preventing similar tragedies in the future.